Welcome to Royal Oak Archives. I'm Jeff Toenniges. With us this afternoon is Dr. David Penney, a columnist and local historian. And we're continuing our discussion on the Royal Oak and St. Mary Cemetaries, located south of 12 Mile between Rochester and Main Streets. And David, why don't we get right into the matter and start talking about some of the deterioration that's gone on in the cemetery. The cemetery's, the Royal Oak at least, is about 170 years old almost. Mm-hmm. Most of those gravestones are made of sandstone and limestone, so obviously there's a fair amount of deterioration that's going on.
Mm-hmm. That's right. The earlier gravestones were made predominantly of sandstone and limestone, and they haven't fared too well through the years. This one that you see here is of Corydon Fay Jr., who died in the Civil War, and it's barely readable, if at all. And I'm not sure how one would try to restore a stone like this.
For those that don't see very well, it's your basic flat tombstone with the rounded top, and as you can see, the sides have all crumbled down.
Mm-hmm. Now this is a stone that's up in the K section, up in the northwest corner of Henry Johnson, and it required digging down about 4 or 5 inches below the surface of the grass to make this one thoroughly visible. The stones, once they fall onto the ground, fall flat, tend to settle. And I suppose they settle and dirt falls on top of them and grass grows over the edges and so on, and they gradually disappear. In fact, we've been finding stones recently that were completely covered by using a metal probe, pushing it into the soil, and if you hit something over you can tell the difference between a pebble and a larger stone, and then you have to dig down with a trowel and you find something.
Is this basically a random procedure that you're doing? Or is there a record somewhere that tells you that there should be a grave somewhere?
There is a map of Royal Oak Cemetery that shows the lots. There are some 970 lots, and they're laid out in the various sections. And it's pretty clear, at least on the map, where the lots are. There are also lot markers around the corners of each of the lots, but in most cases these lot markers have settled and have disappeared as well. So it's not clear. Now the stones are laid out generally in lines, and you'd expect to find a stone in a line then with other stones. Mm-hmm. However, if the stone fell over and was pushed over, or somebody moved it, it could be anywhere, and it could be out of line. So I guess really what would have to be done is to go around and probe the whole cemetery at probably 5 or 6 inch intervals. It could take quite a while to do it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What else do you have here?
This is a gravestone of Lucius Tootle. The verse here is unreadable. At least I have not been able to read it. My eyes are fairly good. Fortunately, Shirley McClelland wrote this verse down about 50 years ago when she was a young girl. It says, "He died in faith, what more can words express, to soothe the mind and make our sorrows less. Removed from us, he treads a brighter sphere and shares the glories he most wished for here." Many of the older stones have been damaged accidentally, such as recently several trees were felled in the cemetery during a storm, and one of the monuments was damaged, but it was possible to repair it. And this probably happens year in, year out. And then, of course, there's always vandals, at least kids. People will say kids but we don't know that it was kids or young people or who it was, or even if it was a human that was damaging the monuments. And this one is of Guy C. Merrill, and it was broken off. It's a sandstone monument and has since been repaired. You could tell that it was recently broken, but because the sandstone is still so white.
Is the majority of the damage you find the stone broken, falling backwards or frontwards, as opposed to crumbling of the top or chips? Or
Well, they do get chipped around the edges in various ways, maybe by the mowing machines year in, year out. They tend to fall over because most of them were not set in cement. Some did have bases, but the cement holding them into the base may have crumbled. And once they fall over, if they're run over by a mowing machine or by a truck bringing another burial in or bringing something in, that'll break these stones.
Yeah. I'd imagine a mower would do a nice job on a stone as well.
Here's a gravestone to William Riley, and this was fixed some years ago, probably many years ago, with cement or some kind of patching material, and now it's broken again. Here's another one to James G. Johnson. It was also fixed at one time, maybe with an epoxy compound. And it's probably going to need repair again soon. This is a particularly interesting monument because at the base it mentions his wife Louisa, and it says that she was an agent of the Sanitary Commission in the relief of the sick and wounded of our army for more than 2 years during the rebellion. Well, they're referring to the Civil War. Mm-hmm. And the Sanitary Commission was prominent during the Civil War in improving the lot of Union soldiers.
There's a term these days with the popularity of using computers for writing, and it's not etched in stone. We can change it. Mm-hmm. Well, obviously, being etched in stone was not always the correct way. If we see on a few of these stones here of some misspellings. And
that's right. That's right. Here's a slide that shows a misspelling of March, of the month of March, M-A-C-H. Another slide shows a misspelling of the last name. It should be D-I-E, or die, I guess, die, but it's spelled in the foreground here, D-E-I. On my own great-grandfather's gravestone, there was an error in chiseling out Knowles. It should have been an E, but it turned out to be an L, and then it was fixed. You can see, obviously, where it was fixed to look like an E. These things do happen.
We had a very astute gravestone supplier, obviously, in the Royal Oak area with all these errors.
This shows the age of individuals buried in the cemetery from birth, from babies all the way up to the very oldest individuals. And you can see that the many babies, actually hundreds of babies, died and are buried in the cemetery. And then the deaths and the number buried decreases in the early years and through early adulthood, and then increases gradually toward middle age, and then peaks out in the 70 to 75 year age, and then decreases of course with greater age, because there are fewer and fewer people still alive at that time. This is probably true for most cemeteries, most areas in the country, I would imagine.
Are there still burials going on in the Royal Oak Cemetery and in St. Mary's?
Yes, there are. There are burials going on in both cemeteries. The lots are not for sale in the Royal Oak Cemetery any longer. I believe they're still available in St. Mary's Cemetery. One of the problems with the Royal Oak Cemetery as far as new burials are concerned, or particularly with selling lots that may have been sold before, in other words, reselling them, mm-hmm. is that the records are not good enough to be sure that there isn't somebody buried there already that they don't know about. Right. So it's very embarrassing, and maybe more than that, embarrassing to bring up some bones in trying to bury somebody fresh. That's mm-hmm. So they're simply not selling lots. That's what I've been told. This is the gravestone to Philip Granger. We thought this was the oldest person in the cemetery, 101 years, but now we found that there is someone who lived to be 103. Causes of death were varied. As I said, large numbers of babies are buried there. so the stillborn rate is high. Stroke is a high rate, cancer at a high rate, various cardiovascular diseases, myocarditis and myocardial infarction or heart attack, and of course also heart failure. Then there's accident, suicide, diphtheria. Not listed here is whooping cough, pneumonia, tuberculosis, many infectious diseases, many more than we would find today among the death records. Many more, because many more people were killed in the earlier times by these diseases before we had various wonder drugs, antibiotics, and so on. And then there were some deaths by carbon monoxide inhalation, and in fact there is one left leg buried in the cemetery, I believe of a physician.
Just the left leg?
Just the left leg. And I won't say where or whose left leg it was.
Is there a marker showing where it is?
No, there's no marker, but it's in the records.
Okay.
We find veterans of virtually all the wars that the United States has been involved in the Royal Oak Cemetery. The Revolutionary War, we have two veterans of that war, Ezra Parker and Elijah Drake. And of the Civil War, 10, Spanish-American War, 1, World War I, 21, World War II, 17, and so on.
We see that the Catholic cemetery started a little late for the Veterans, and that's due primarily that the cemetery wasn't founded until the late 1800s, right?
Right, about 1875, although we think there were burials there earlier, maybe in early 1860s there may have been a few burials. There was a Catholic congregation in the Royal Oak area, I believe starting in the 1840s and 50s, and it was located over near 12 Mile Road and Campbell Road. But I think burials in the early time were carried out in Detroit. That's my understanding. And it wasn't until the 1860s and 70s that the congregation decided to have its own separate burial ground, a local burial ground. Right. Now this shows the grave marker for Ezra Parker, here shown here between the monuments to the two members of the Wood family. Ezra Parker was a veteran of the Revolutionary War, as said, and the local DAR chapter is named for him, the Ezra Parker chapter of the DAR. The marker was placed on a large boulder. This boulder seen here, taken from the Parker homestead in 1928 with the help of Joyce Webb, who was a sixth-generation descendant. Behind the boulder with the bronze marker, we see a slab, which at one time, I believe it's limestone, which at one time was standing upright, now is lying on the ground. Mr. Parker was born in 1745 and lived in Wallingford, Connecticut. He took part in the Revolution at Lexington and was at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He went as an orderly with Benedict Arnold to Quebec and was with him on the Plains of Abraham. He was also with General Stark at Bennington, Vermont, and at Saratoga. He moved to Royal Oak Township with his son William M. Parker when he was 89 years old, buying land just north of John Benjamin's. Now, John Benjamin's land was on Woodward Avenue, just opposite Roseland Park Cemetery, and Parkers bought their land up near a 13-mile road in Woodward, and about where the Northwood Shopping Center is today.
Parker School.
The Parker School is named for him, that's right. He died in Royal Oak in 1842, age 97 years. And that homestead, where the Northwood Shopping Center is today, stood until 1953 when the shopping center was built.
Stories he could have told.
And this is a photograph of the, well, it's a slide of the etching in the 1877 history of Oakland County of the Parker homestead there, as it supposedly looked. The other veteran of the Revolutionary War is Elijah Drake, who was born in 1759 and died in 1847. And a marker was erected, had his gravesite shown here by the Ezra Parker chapter of the DAR. We also have a daughter of a Revolutionary War soldier, Lydia Bull Parker, buried very close to the grave of Ezra Parker. And this is from a 1940 article, I believe, in the Daily Tribune. And this is the bronze marker from located on her stone monument. It's very difficult to read.
Yeah.
There's also a Civil War monument in the Royal Oak Cemetery in J section.
Where is J section?
J section is at the north end of the cemetery, kind of in the middle, between midway between Rochester Road and Main Street.
Near the flagpole.
The flagpole, exactly.
Okay.
The flagpole is right behind the. You can just see it there behind the boulder. And this Civil War monument lists a number of soldiers who died in the Civil War. I would point out in particular George Briggs here and James Briggs, and I think
related to the Tigers Briggs family?
I'm not sure of that. That I'm not sure of. And also Corydon Fay, who I mentioned earlier.
Right.
Well, the Briggs brothers are also mentioned on a monument farther south in the cemetery, a large stone monument to the Briggs family. And it says here that George Briggs was the son of Zebedee and Ann Maria Briggs, born in Oakland County. He fell at the Battle of Chickamauga in the Civil War. And his older brother, James W. Briggs, fell at the same battle. Both of them fell in the same day, September 20th, 1863. Now, if you look at the burial records for the cemetery, they're not buried in the cemetery. Obviously, they couldn't bring a body back to Michigan in those years.
Right.
They didn't. During the Civil War, they were buried somewhere, probably where the battle took place.
Right.
But they simply memorialized them here on either side of the large monument. This is a little monument or marker indicating the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, which was a organization that arose after the Civil War, much like the
VFW.
VFW. That's right. Today.
So those would be on veterans' graves or near them.
That's right, but that's the only GAR a little marker that I know that. As far as I believe, it's the only one left in the cemetery. They're fairly portable, unfortunately. This is a marker to Frank Drake, who was a son of Fleming and Electa Drake. Fleming Drake was a physician, quite a prominent physician in Royal Oak around the time of the Civil War. Well, his son, Frank, was only 16 years old when he enlisted in the U.S. Navy in 1864, and he was killed in action on the gunboat Undine, part of the United States Navy. October 31st, 1864. So that's really very young, isn't it?
Yeah.
16 years and 6 months.
I think they'll kick you out for that age these days.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Well, this is right there near Elijah Drake's monument. This is a monument to Ralsman A. Parker, who served in the Union Army. And he was involved in the Battle of Antietam, I guess it is. He also became a respected attorney in Detroit and died in 1925 at a rather advanced age. This is John L. Norton, who was a Spanish-American War veteran. 1st Vermont Infantry, Company L, I guess it's a Span-Am War. And then we have down in, I believe, B section, Margaret Irene Parr, daughter of Captain George Parr, who graduated from Birmingham High School and Harper Hospital School of Nursing. She died of influenza, which was in 1918, and probably some of you recall that there was an epidemic of influenza that swept Western Europe and North America at that time. So she was serving in the Army Nurse Corps at Camp Grant, Illinois, when she died.
How do we know? Are there records somewhere that tell us where these people died? In some cases, they say right on the stone where.
They do, of course. In some cases, we can find a newspaper report if it's in this century. Other cases, we can look in the 1877 history of Oakland County, and that provides information. My own great-grandfather was written up in that history, and it provided a lot of information for me in doing my family history. But it's kind of spotty. Royal Oak didn't have a newspaper of any sort before, 1910, I think it was. There were two little newspapers. One was called The Experiment, and the other was called I've forgotten the name, but they only ran for about a year. So Royal Oak was essentially without a newspaper. It had to rely on Detroit newspapers and so on, which wouldn't pick up on a lot of local things. So it is difficult to get this information that you're asking about in many cases. Very difficult. And here's a man who was killed in action in World War II, Irwin George Nopin. That's in St. Mary's Cemetery. For me, interest in the Royal Oak Cemetaries began on a very personal note with my own great-great-grandfather, William H. Knowles, and this is his rather impressive pink granite monument that's found in Section E over near Rochester Road. He was born in 1807 in Tadcaster, Yorkshire, England. I've been to Tadcaster. It's a small town outside the city of York. It's a brewery town. Presently has two breweries. It smells like a brewery when you go through the town. He came to the United States in 1827 with little money. He was a skilled carpenter. He lived in New York. And then he moved on to Detroit. And eventually he bought land in Royal Oak Township in 1854 and then moved out here kind of in semi-retirement in 1867. When the population of Royal Oak was probably 250 at most. It was very small. It wasn't even a village yet at that time. He moved to a house on Lincoln Avenue, which is now owned by the McCavey family. The house still stands there, and it may in fact be the oldest house in Royal Oak, although we don't have positive records to that effect. We say that the Orson Starr house up on Main Street is the oldest house, built in 1845, but there is some evidence that his house on Lincoln might actually predate it, but I don't think we can prove it. He was married 3 times. His first 2 wives died of various diseases, fathered 15 children, and one of the children from the third marriage was my great-grandfather, Frank Lincoln Knowles. And there are many other Knowleses buried in this area, and also Wattses, and as I mentioned, the Watch family, and Stiffs, and a number of others.
How many did you say that are related? Are in the cemetery?
Probably 60 or 70. I haven't counted them all up.
You count for a fair portion of the cemetery. Let's continue our tour here through the cemetery.
Let's see. That's the old gentleman. And this was his house on Lincoln Avenue, out of the 1877 history of Oakland County. This is a slide that was taken just a few days ago, actually. It shows some of the restoration that we've accomplished. This is on the left is the gravestone of Erastus Ferguson, who was a very, very early pioneer of the Royal Oak area, and his gravestone was broken off at the bottom, if you can see down there, where there's a kind of a line of gray material. Well, we cemented that back together and stood it up. The other gravestone on the right is to his wife, and that's broken in the middle as well as having been broken off at the base, and we're not sure what we're going to do with that as yet.
You've mentioned a lot of the damage that's in the cemetery, and some of these repairs that we've been seeing. Who's now doing all these? Is the city doing it? Is it a group of volunteers like you?
It's volunteers. At this point, it's volunteers. And I don't know what will happen in the future. We've talked about bringing professionals into the picture. Increased costs would be involved. I simply don't know.
Yeah.
This shows Dale Ellis, one of our group, who was probing with this device on the right here. It's simply a broomstick with a kind of a long screwdriver attached to it, probing, and he found this small gravestone under the grass. So they are there, but you've got to find them.
How many has your group of volunteers found so far?
Well, we've found 3 or 4 at this point, but we haven't done any concerted search in that direction. We've talked about it for the last couple of years, but we've been busy putting the records on computer and photographing what we can see on the surface. That takes a lot of time.
Now, these records that you've been putting together, are they available to the general public?
I think they will be. We're planning to publish 3 books on Royal Oak. One book will be on the cemetery. It will be a printout of all the burials and all the lot records for the cemetery. Maybe in 6 months, maybe 8 or 9 months, we're not sure. Another book we're putting together is kind of general on the history of Royal Oak, material that hasn't been published before, either in the Perkins book or the Crossman book. And there's another book which will probably contain an index to all sources on Royal Oak, because a lot of the books that have been published don't have any indexes, so they may be good reading, but you can't find things in them if you want to go and look them up. And I've indexed all the books now, so we can find things. Now, this is another monument that was found. That's a very large one, actually. You can see by the size of the whisk broom there and the probe. That was completely covered by sod. You can see it's still kind of wet.
You touched on your books, and you have a book that you and Lois Lance published together, and it touches on about 50, is it?
There are 50 monuments in there that are mentioned, and you go into the parking lot between Royal Oak Cemetery and St. Mary's Cemetery, and there's a kind of mailbox there, and you can take one of these booklets out, and you can walk north on one side, and then you come back on the other, and then into St. Mary's Cemetery, and you can look at all of these different monuments, and it tells you about the people, their lives, and so on. It's a nice, probably 45-minute to 1-hour walking tour.
And it would be a nice way to spend a nice, cool fall day in the next month or two, or even when the spring thaws the snow away. But these are available at no cost as a courtesy of some folks here in town. And we want to thank you and Lois Lantz for putting these together. And thank you for joining us here, giving us a kind of a living room tour of our 2 great cemeteries here in town, and a walk through history, meeting some of the great people who made Royal Oak what it is. I'm Jeff Toenniges, and this is Royal Oak Archives. We hope you join us again for another tour through history in the city of Royal Oak.